All right. Welcome to Streaming Capital. I'm going to be working through this book, Capital, by Karl Marx, which is incredibly long and incredibly intimidating. Um, and there are a number of guides you can find. You can find a number of lecture series by David Harvey. There's a new one by a Yale professor. But none of these actually go through Capital line by line, word by word. All of them are sort of useful accompaniments to reading Capital, but none of them actually, go through every line because that will take a very long time. It will take us a very long time. Well, you gotta start difficult tasks somewhere, and I think that there is some use here in this format for taking on Capital because as it's a very intimidating text, it's also something that is hard to go through in audiobook format, for example, because, well, sometimes you're going to arrive at lines that you stop at, have to puzzle over, don't understand at first. And so I think one of the useful things of doing this project that I'm attempting here will be that, I'll also be struggling with the text. I have read Capital before as part of a seminar and part of a political group, but I'm also hardly, the qualified expert on it or anything. There are plenty of things I will miss or misunderstand, and will be working through as best I can the circumstances. I think that is a good way to deal with Capital as a project. This is a text that historically, back for the Russian Revolution, you had workers who would, they'd only have one copy of Capital among the group, and they would tear it up into different chapter components and take turns, each reading a different little collection within it, reading Capital out of order, in order, and sort of trying to come to a collective understanding of it. And I think it's also something that's important to not be afraid of getting wrong and being wrong, attempting it. Part of what inspired me to take on a book like this in a streaming format was actually I was looking through the Yale lecture series they did on Capital, and I noticed oh wait, no, you got this thing wrong on Marx, biographical details. Oh, you got that wrong. No, Marx wasn't there at the Paris Commune. He was writing about it and then presented to the First International afterwards, but he wasn't addressing people at the Commune itself. So, if even a distinguished Yale professor can get elements of this book wrong, don't feel bad about getting it wrong. And there's a tremendous amount of debate that is followed this book and the interpretation of this book. David Harvey is a huge expert on Capital, obviously, and has his lecture series that you can see. But there are plenty of criticisms of David Harvey. There's a debate over whether he correctly interprets Marx or not. There are some aspects of Marx's theory that he rejects. Similarly with Michael Heinrich, who's one of the leading German scholars on Capital, he maintains a school that basically rejects fundamentally certain aspects of Marx's theory, and so his own interpretation of Capital is marked heavily by that. And it's a reality of the academic world also that people are afraid to get things wrong publicly. I have some qualifications to take on a task like this. I edit for an academic Marxist journal as my day job. I do a lot of I've written, I've been a militant on the left for a long time. And I have a certain level of qualifications, but I also am not afraid to say that we're like I'm likely going to get some things wrong, or run into some things and not understand it. Try and wrap my head around making it work afterwards. It's a difficult task, and in one of these prefaces that we're going to go through today. Marx himself talks about the difficulty of it and the difficulty of science and learning and understanding and the work that goes into it. So yeah, it's a difficult task, and and there isn't even one great expert you can look to understand and interpret capital, and it's one of those texts that you can visit and revisit throughout your life, and since it treats the mode of production under which we live, you're going to find evolving aspects of it that call out to you or get your attention more. And yeah, don't be afraid of a difficult text and a long project. So yeah, I have here with me two important accompaniments. I have my cat, Boom Boom, which you can't be a good Marxist without a cat. And I have the Penguin edition of Capital, which I like. Has lots of pages. It gives you that really good, when you have one of these books and you a lot of pages, and then you get that smell that comes off the book. Yeah, it's good to have a physical copy when you have a chance, but we will also be going through with the same text here on the screen. And yeah, it's going to take some work, but we're going to work through it. And this is going to be going forward. I'm going to try and do something like this every Sunday, as well as the normal streams I do on Twitch, doing far less serious stuff. And so yeah, it will be here, and we're also on YouTube as well. I don't know if we'll have as much reach on YouTube, but I have had a channel there before. And yeah, this will kind of be a accompaniment of my own journey revisiting Capital. And I hope some of you will enjoy or find usefulness out of the process of accompanying me through that. So without further ado, let's dive right into the text. I'm going to skip the introduction by Mandel, which is rather long, and we're going to just focus on the text itself, starting with these prefaces by Marx. So yeah, let's jump in. The preface to the first edition. This work, whose first volume I now submit to the public, forms the continuation of my book, Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. Don't pay too much attention to my German. My German is not going to be right. Published in 1859. And here it has the footnote leading to English translation, a contribution to the critique of political economy, with the publishing below. The long pause between the first part and the continuation is due to an illness of many years' duration, which interrupted my work again and again. The substance of that earlier work is summarized in the first chapter of this volume. Here, the note points out that the first chapter in the first edition, in subsequent editions, including this one, this first chapter was expanded to 3 chapters, which we will be taking on in turn. This is done not merely for the sake of connectedness and completeness. The presentation is improved. As far as circumstances in any way permit, many points only hinted at in the earlier book are here worked out more fully, while conversely, points worked out fully there are only touched upon in this volume. Sections on the history of the theories of value and of money are now, of course, left out altogether. However, the reader of the earlier work will find new sources relating to the history of those theories in the notes to the first chapter. Beginnings are always difficult in all sciences. This is an important one to hang on a bit, as he's He's advising us that the most challenging part of this text is going to come at the beginning. And there are later points where he actually recommended people take on capital, like out of order, starting with some of the more historical chapters and returning to the more theoretical ones at the beginning. Beginnings are always difficult in all sciences. The understanding of the first chapter, especially the section that contains the analysis of commodities, will therefore present the greatest difficulty. I have popularized the passages concerning the substance of value and the magnitude of value as much as possible. Here, another side note, in this edition, numbered footnotes are Marx's own. Those marked by asterisks are the translation. The value form, whose fully developed shape is the money form, is very simple and slight in content. Nevertheless, the human mind has sought in vain for more than 2,000 years to get to the bottom of it. While on the other hand, there has been at least an approximation to a successful analysis of forms which are much richer in content and more complex. Why? Because the complete body is easier to study than its cells. Moreover, in the analysis of economic forms, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of assistance. The power of abstraction must replace both. But for bourgeois society, commodity form of the product of labor or the value form of the commodity is the economic cell form. To the superficial observer, the analysis of these forms seems to turn upon minutiae. It does in fact deal with minutiae, but so similarly does microscopic anatomy. So here, Marx is, laying out both the challenges we're going to be facing running through this test. That the beginning is indeed difficult, and that since we are dealing with something around capital, around the mode of production, around how human societies organize themselves, this isn't something that you can look into a microscope and see X. We have to use tools, intellectual tools here of abstraction, of categories, of working through the internal logics of things and how they connect together to try to effectively understand it. Turning to the text, with the exception of the section on the form of value, therefore, this volume cannot stand accused on the score of difficulty. I assume, of course, a reader who is willing to learn something new and therefore to think for himself. Now, it can stand accused of difficulty. But, he certainly has tried to make this as accessible as possible. And again, you don't have to come out of this with a perfect understanding of capital. It's something you can return to and build on. Let's bring the text down. The physicist either observes natural processes where they occur in their most significant form, and are least affected by disturbing influences, or wherever possible, he makes experiments under conditions which ensure that the process will occur in its pure state. What I have to examine in this work is the capitalist mode of production, and the relations of production and forms of intercourse, verkersverhältnisse, that correspond to it. Until now, their locus classicus has been England. This is the reason why England is used as the main illustration of the theoretical developments I make. If, however, the German reader theoretically shrugs his shoulders at the condition of the English industrial and agricultural workers, or optimistically comforts himself with the thought that in Germany things are not nearly so bad, I must plainly tell him, de tu fabula narratur. The tale is told of you, from Horace. Intrinsically, it is not a question of the higher or lower degree of development of the social antagonisms that spring from the natural laws of capitalist production. It is a question of these laws themselves, of these tendencies winning their way through and working themselves out with iron necessity. The country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. This is a very famous phrase of Marx, and it is one that, with some of the later development of capitalism would be questioned historically due to, obviously it wasn't just that every country transformed into a similar process as England went through. But certainly in terms of how it wasn't even the case in Germany. Germany went through its own process of industrialization, but which was, also had distinctness to the English model and the French model. And that expanded even at a greater extent with how Russia developed and how we've seen subsequent development of capitalism around the world, including the rise of things like imperialism, how colonialism played out, how many of those relations are reinforced, and structured in a way that maintains the interests of capitalism, but didn't exactly bring everything along that same path. But it's important to mark out that Marx here is talking about analyzing and understanding social logic, which is now the social logic which governs the vast majority of the world and the vast majority of human relations. And that is kind of one of the things you risk by obviously taking on something as complex as the world social system and analyzing it through the categories you have to build, the intellectual tools you have to deploy to analyze its internal logic, and to do so on the basis of its own presuppositions, the basis of what it itself is structured around. Returning to the text. But in any case, and apart from all this, where capitalist production has made itself at home amongst us, and here we have more footnotes by Marx. There will be many of these, and some of these are long digressions. Here, it's analyzing amongst the Germans. So he's speaking here primarily to the German audience at this point. For instance, in the factories properly so called, the situation is much worse than in England, because the counterpoise of the factory acts is absent. In all other spheres, and not just like the rest of continental Western Europe, suffer not only from the development of capitalist production, but also from the incompleteness of that development. Alongside the modern evils, we are oppressed by a whole series of inherited evils, arising from the passive survival of archaic and outmoded modes of production, with their accompanying trains of anachronistic social and political relations. We suffer not only from the living, but from the dead. Les morts s'associent les vies. The dead man clutches on to the living. Here again, you were able to see the artistry of Marx in writing, and we're going to see this over and over again, that he's going to bring up these great literary references, whether it's going back to Horace or grabbing from Goethe or Shakespeare. He definitely, he greatly appreciated literature of his time, and brings it into Capital, and in many ways structures it in an almost novelesque form. And yeah, he's sort of emphasizing, in Germany, under the German conditions, they're not only dealing with the horrors of capitalism, but also remnants of the horrors of feudalism. Marx is always very clear that he has no idealized vision of pre-capitalist modes of production, of what was feudalism, of what were the absolute monarchies, what was ancient slavery. All of these he denounces, and he considers, capital's role in upending those modes of production to be progressive and important. He just, says that there's a future beyond that we can continue to push forward, and in turn take on the fresh new horrors that the capitalist mode of production unleashes, alongside what we can take positively of it having removed many of the old horrors that came before. The social statistics of Germany and the rest of continental Western Europe are, in comparison with those of England, quite wretched. but they raised the veil just enough to let us catch a glimpse of the Medusa's head behind it. We should be appalled at our own circumstances if, as in England, our governments and parliaments periodically appointed commissions of inquiry into economic conditions. If these commissions were armed with the same plenary powers to get at the truth, if it were possible to find for this purpose men as competent, as free from partisanship and respect of persons as are England's factory inspectors, her medical reporters on public health, her commissioners of inquiry into the exploitation of women and children, into conditions of housing and nourishment, and so on. Perseus wore a magic cap so that the monsters he hunted down might not see him. We draw the magic cap down over our own eyes and ears so as to deny that there are any monsters. Again, a beautiful literary emphasis by Marx here. Let us not deceive ourselves about this. Just as in the 18th century, the American War of Independence sounded the tocsin for the European middle class, so in the 19th century, the American Civil War did the same for the European working class. In England, the process of transformation is palpably evident. When it has reached a certain point, it must react on the continent. There, it will take a form more brutal or more humane according to the degree of development of the working class itself. Apart from any higher motives than the most basic interest of the present ruling classes dictates them that they clear out of the way all the legally removable obstacles to development of the working class. For this reason, among others, I have devoted a great deal of space in this volume to the history, details, and the results of the English factory legislation. One nation can and should learn from others. Even when a society has begun to track down the natural laws of its movement, and it is the ultimate aim of this work to reveal the economic law of motion of modern society, it can neither leap over the natural phases of its development nor remove them by decree, but it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs. To prevent possible misunderstandings, let me say this. I do not by any means depict the capitalist and the landowner in rosy colors, but individuals are dealt with here only insofar as they are the personifications of economic category, the bearers of particular class relations and interests. My standpoint, from which the development of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he remains, socially speaking, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. In the domain of political economy, free scientific inquiry does not merely meet the same enemies as in all other domains. The peculiar nature of the material it deals with summons into fray on the opposing side the most violent, sordid, and malignant passions of the human breast, the furies of private interest. The established church, for instance, will more readily pardon an attack on 38 of its 39 articles than on 1/39 of its income. Nowadays, atheism itself is a culpa levis, venial sin, as compared with the criticism of existing property relations. Nevertheless, even here there is an unmistakable advance. I refer, as an example, to the Blue Book published within the last few weeks, correspondence with Her Majesty's missions abroad regarding industrial questions and trades unions. There, the representatives of the English Crown in foreign countries declare in plain language that in Germany, in France, in short, in all the civilized states of the European continent, a radical change in the existing relations between capital and labor is as evident and inevitable as in England. At the same time, on the other side of the ocean, Mr. Wada, Vice President of the United States, has declared in public meetings that after the abolition of slavery, a radical transformation in the existing relations of capital and landed property is on the agenda. These are signs of the times, not to be hidden by purple mantles or black cassocks. They do not signify that tomorrow a miracle will occur. They do show that, within the ruling classes themselves, the foreboding is emerging that the present society is no solid crystal, but an organism capable of change, constantly engaged in a process of change. The second volume of this work will deal with the process of the circulation of capital, Book 2, and the various forms of the process of capital in its totality, Book 3, while the third and last volume, Book 4, will deal with the history of the theory. Here's a historical note. Books 2 and 3 were issued by Engels after Marx's death as separate volumes and are referred to as volumes 2 and 3, as they are generally known. This would have made book 4 volume 4, but this was ultimately published by Kautsky as Theories of Surplus Value, and Engels didn't quite get to it. I welcome every opinion based on scientific criticism. As to the prejudices of so-called public opinion, to which I have never made concessions, now as ever, my maxim is that of the great Florentine. Go on your way and let the people talk. Segui el tuo corso e lascia dir la gente. I'm not going to pronounce the Latin correctly. And here there's also a footnote mentioning that Marx is altering Dante's words to make them fit a bit better, which, again, he's bringing in a reference from the Divine Comedy. Marx is always bringing in these great literary references, which you do not see done among works of economics. So yeah, here's kind of, this was the preface to the first edition. So this was from 1867. So it was still relatively early. Marx continued to live a number of years, and we're going to go through in some of these upcoming prefaces, some of the other things he would kind of add on to that. In particular, the conviction mentioned around, England being the mirror of the future of all other societies was something that there would be more sort of skepticism around in Marx's later years, and as the subsequent development of capitalism showed. All right, we have quite a few of these prefaces. There are 4 prefaces in total. Well, this one's a postface, so we get prefaces and postfaces. All right, let's dive into this next one. I must start by informing the readers of the first edition about the alterations made in the second edition. Clearer arrangements of the book will be immediately apparent. Additional notes are everywhere marked as notes to the second edition. Following are the most important points with regard to the text itself. In Chapter 1, Section 1, the derivation of value by analysis of the equations in which every exchange value is expressed has been carried out with greater scientific strictness. This is also a point where, when we get there, we will pause the time and work through many of the equations, because there is math in this book, which is extra scary. It's not as scary in Volume 1, but when we get to Volume 3, it gets quite scary. And I'm not 100% sure on all of the equations in Volume 3. But they're mathematical equations, but they're also logical. We will deal with those in more depth when we get there. Similarly, the connection between the substance of value and the determination of the magnitude of value by the labor time socially necessary, which was only alluded to in the first edition, is now expressly emphasized. Chapter 1, Section 3 on the form of value has been completely revised, a task which was made necessary by the twofold presentation of it in the first edition, if by nothing else. Let me remark in passing that this twofold presentation was occasioned by my friend Dr. Kugelmann in Hanover. I was visiting him in the spring of 1867 when the first proof sheets arrived from Hamburg, and he convinced me that most readers needed a supplementary, more didactic exposition of the form of value. The last section of the first chapter, the fetishism of commodities, etc., has been altered considerably. Chapter 3, Section 1 on the measure of values has been carefully revised, because in the first edition, this section was treated carelessly, the reader having been referred to the explanation already given in Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, on the critique of political economy, Berlin, 1859. Chapter 7, particularly Section 2, has been reworked to a great extent. It would be pointless to go into all the partial textual changes, which are often purely stylistic. They occur throughout the book. Nevertheless, I find now, on revising the French translation, which is appearing in Paris, that several parts of the German original stand in need of a rather thorough reworking, while other parts require rather heavy stylistic editing, and still others require the painstaking elimination of occasional slips. But there was no time for that, for I was informed only in the autumn of 1871, when in the midst of other urgent work, that the book was sold out and the printing of the second edition was to begin in January 1872. The appreciation which Das Kapital rapidly gained in wide circles of the German working class is the best reward for my labors. A man who in economic matters represents the bourgeois standpoint, the Viennese manufacturer Herr Meyer, in a pamphlet published during the Franco-German War. Here's a note on Meyer, Sigmund Meyer, Die Sozialfrage in Wien, aptly expounded the idea that the great capacity for theory, which used to be considered a hereditary German attribute, had almost completely disappeared amongst the so-called educated classes in Germany, but that amongst the working class, on the contrary, it was enjoying a revival. Political economy remains a foreign science in Germany up to this very moment. In his Geschichtliche Darstellung des Handels der Gewerbe, especially in the first two volumes, published in 1830, Gustav von Gulick has already examined, for the most part, the historical circumstances that prevented the development of the capitalist mode of production in Germany, and consequently the construction there of modern bourgeois society. Thus, the living soil from which political economy springs was absent. It had to be imported from England and France as a ready-made article. German professors always remain pupils. The theoretical expression of an alien reality turned in their hands into a collection of dogmas, interpreted by them in the sense of the petty bourgeois world surrounding them, and therefore misinterpreted. The feeling of scientific impotence, a feeling which could not entirely be suppressed, and the uneasy awareness that they had to master an area in fact entirely foreign to them, was only imperfectly concealed beneath a parade of literary and historical erudition, or by an admixture of extraneous material borrowed from the so-called cameral sciences. Here is a note: Kameralwissenschaft, or cameralism, was the German version of mercantilism. It tended to see political economy in narrow terms as a matter of finance and administration, since it arose as a set of ideas as to how the rulers of Germany, German princely states, could use their revenues to promote the state's well-being. Notably, cameralists were von Kornig in the 17th and Giusti in the 18th century. A medley of smatterings through whose purgatory the hopeful candidate for the German bureaucracy has to pass. Since 1848, capitalist production has developed rapidly in Germany, and at the present time it is in the full bloom of speculation and swindling. But fate is still impropitious to our professional economists. At the time when they were able to deal with political economy in an unprejudiced way, modern economic conditions were absent from the reality of Germany. And as soon as these conditions did come into existence, it was under circumstances that no longer permitted their impartial investigation within the bounds of the bourgeois horizon. Insofar as political economy is bourgeois, i.e., insofar as it views the capitalist order as the absolute and ultimate form of social production, instead of as a historically transient stage of development, can only remain a science while the class struggle remains latent or manifests itself only in isolated and sporadic phenomena. So here he's talking about a process that mirrors in many ways the development of the political experience as well that he went for as part of a German radical intellectual in this period who had hopes in years of 1848 when there were a series of bourgeois revolutions across Europe, and where many of those were frustrated, of course, because the bourgeoisie, having already established itself as a significant social class with its own interests and its own concerns, began to be more terrified of the potential of the proletariat rising up against them as well in turn, as opposed to earlier periods where the bourgeoisie was able to lead political movements that had a more clear universal appeal. And you have obviously there's the example of the French Revolution, and a series of similar movements across Europe in those periods. And at this point, from 1848 on, it was clear for a whole generation of radical intellectuals that the bourgeoisie was making its peace with different aristocratic dignitaries and doing so to prioritize social order over the supposedly universal values, that they should be embodying or that they would have been expected to be embodying. And here Marx is also talking about, general difficulty. You see this all the time in typical bourgeois presentations of, the history of economics or whatever. Like all of world history appears like, it's just, they were just waiting for someone to, come up with free market capitalism, which is supposedly the, natural condition of the world corresponding to human nature to put forward economic and technological progress, and everything that impeded that or was different from that was just a sort of irrational impediment to the correct capitalist mode of functioning, which will be our mode of functioning for the rest of human history. And Marx, of course, is pointing out that capitalism, like the modes of production which preceded it, like feudalism, like different forms of tributary systems, ancient slavery, pre-modern slavery, like all of those, there is a future beyond that specific mode of production. And this book was part of outlining what he saw as some of the contradictions that would bring that to the fore and make possible superseding the capitalist mode of production for another one. All right, let's return to the text. Let us take England. Its classical political economy belongs to a period in which the class struggle was as yet undeveloped. The last great representative, Ricardo, ultimately and consciously made the antagonism of class interests, of wages and profits, of profits and rent, the starting point of his investigations, naively taking this antagonism for a social law of nature. But with this contribution, the bourgeois science of economics had reached the limits beyond which it could not pass. Already in Ricardo's lifetime and in opposition to him, it was met by criticism in the person of Simondi. And here he has a note, see my work on the critique of political economy. The succeeding period, from 1820 to 1830, was notable in England for the lively scientific activity which took place in the field of political economy. It was a period of both the vulgarizing and the extending of Ricardo's theory, and of the contest of that theory with the old school. Splendid tournaments were held. What was achieved at that time is little known on the European continent, as the polemic is for the most part scattered over articles of views, pièces d'occasion, and pamphlets. The unprejudiced character of this polemic, although Ricardo's theory already serves in exceptional cases as a weapon with which to attack the bourgeois economic system, is explained by the circumstances of the time. On the one hand, large-scale industry itself was only just emerging from its childhood, as is shown by the fact that the periodic cycle of its modern life opens for the first time with the crisis of 1825. On the other hand, the class struggle between capital and labor was forced into the background, politically by the discord between the governments and the feudal aristocracy gathered around the Holy Alliance. This is talking about the Holy Alliance in these days was in particular an alliance of post-Napoleonic reactionary states, in particular Russia at the head, but you also had the Bourbons, again, their sort of successors ruling in France, and you had this sort of general triumph of a number of reactionary governments that continued up until there was a new sort of outburst in 1848. Feudal aristocracy gathered around the Holy Alliance, assembled in one camp, and the mass of the people, led by the bourgeoisie in the other camp, and economically by the quarrel between industrial capital and aristocratic landed property. This latter quarrel was concealed in France by the antagonism between small-scale, fragmented property and big land ownership, but in England it broke out openly after the passing of foreign laws. Literature of political economy in England at this time calls to mind the economic storm and stress period, which in France followed the death of Dr. Quesnay. Here, a note. Dr. Quesnay died in 1774. His death was immediately followed by Turgot's attempt to put physiocratic ideas into practice while he was Louis XVI's Controller General. His fall in 1776 opened a period of political and economic crisis, which culminated in the French Revolution. It is this which Marx has in mind, rather than the somewhat exiguous theoretical writings of the period after 1774. But only as an Indian summer reminds us of spring. With the year 1830, there came the crisis which was to be decisive, once and for all. In France and England, the bourgeoisie had conquered political power. From that time on, the class struggle took on more and more explicit and threatening forms, both in practice and in theory. It sounded the knell of scientific bourgeois economics. It was thenceforth no longer a question whether this or that theorem was true, but whether it was useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, in accordance with police regulations or contrary to them. In place of disinterested inquirers, there stepped hired prize fighters. In place of genuine scientific research, the bad conscience and evil intent of apologetics. Still, even the importunate pamphlets with which the Anti-Corn Law League, led by the manufacturers Cobden and Bright, deluge the world, offer a historical interest, if no scientific one, on account of their polemic against the landed aristocracy. But since then, the free trade legislation inaugurated by Sir Robert Peel has deprived vulgar economics even of this last thing. So here he's talking about basically the degeneration of the science of economics, which felt pressured intellectually by the conditions emerging in Europe, and which sort of retreated from asking more serious questions and retreated from taking on the landed aristocracy in a period which the bourgeoisie largely found different ways to make peace with and bring on the landed aristocracy. And, that was something that was in the bourgeoisie's interest as well, because, while the capitalists, if you're just a capitalist and you're constantly in the race for capital, it's difficult to have much security, but the ability to, purchase land and hold rents is something that offers a tremendous amount of security comparatively, and is able to ensure your long-term reproduction, your social reproduction within your class in long term. And so there's this sort of point where the bourgeoisie basically makes peace with the landed aristocracy and rentiers, and you can see hints of this in some of the early writings. Like every now and then people like to mention Adam Smith. Adam Smith's view on landlords was not good. He did not like landlords. He saw them as unproductive, as parasites on what was the actual socially productive aspect, and that's something that has kind of disappeared and lost as economics evolves. And in the modern day, it basically doesn't really treat very much with great questions of social or political organization. It essentially dedicates itself to how to efficiently predict the movement of markets within a series of social constraints that basically presume capitalism is there and presume that the sort of social and political conditions that enable or justify markets to exist are already there, and it no longer concerns itself with, what would be the question of political economy, which is, what Marx is writing this Capital as a critique of political economy. The political aspect is basically absent, or better said, it's presupposed in a way that avoids it being questioned by most of modern economics. The Continental Revolution of 1848 also had its reaction in England. Men who still claimed some scientific standing and aspired to be something more than mere sophists and sycophants of the ruling class tried to harmonize the political economy of capital with the claims, no longer to be ignored, of the proletariat. Hence a shallow syncretism, of which John Stuart Mill is the best representative. This is a declaration of bankruptcy by bourgeois economics, an event already illuminated in a masterly manner by the great Russian scholar and critic N. Chernyshevsky in his Outlines of Political Economy according to Mill. In Germany, therefore, the capitalist mode of production came to maturity after its antagonistic character had already been revealed, with much sound and fury, by the historical struggles which took place in France and England. Moreover, the German proletariat had in the meantime already attained a far clearer theoretical awareness than the German bourgeoisie. Thus, at the very moment when a bourgeois science of political economy at last seemed possible in Germany, it had in reality again become impossible. Under these circumstances, its spokesmen divided into two groups. One set, prudent, practical business folk, flocked to the banner of Bastiat, the most superficial and therefore the most successful representative of apologetic vulgar economics. The other set, proud of the professional dignity of their science, followed John Stuart Mill in his attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable. Just as in the classical period of bourgeois economics, so also in the period of its decline, the Germans remained mere pupils, imitators and followers, petty retailers and hawkers in the service of the great foreign wholesale concern. Peculiar historical development of German society therefore excluded any original development of bourgeois economics there, but did not exclude its critique. Insofar as such a critique represents a class, it can only represent the class whose historical task is the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and the final abolition of all classes, the proletariat. The learned and unlearned spokesmen of the German bourgeoisie tried at first to kill Das Kapital with silence, a technique which had succeeded with my earlier writings. As soon as they found that these tactics no longer fitted the conditions of the time, they wrote prescriptions for tranquilizing the bourgeois mind, on the pretext of criticizing my book. But they found in the workers' press, see, for example, Joseph Dietzkin's articles in the Volksstadt, champions stronger than themselves, to whom they still owe a reply even now. And here is a footnote by Marx. The mealy-mouthed babblers of German vulgar economics grumbled about the style of my book. No one can feel the literary shortcomings of Capital more strongly than I myself. Yet I will quote in this connection one English and one Russian notice for the benefit of the enjoyment of these gentlemen and their public. Saturday Review, an entirely hostile journal, said in its notice of the first edition, the presentation of the subject invests the driest economic questions with a certain peculiar charm. The St. Petersburg Journal, in its issue of April 20th, 1872, says, presentation of the subject, with the exception of one or two excessively specialized parts, is distinguished by its comprehensibility to the general reader, its clearness, and, in spite of the high scientific level of the questions discussed, by an unusual liveliness. In this respect, the author in no way resembles the majority of German scholars who write their books in a language so dry and obscure that the heads of ordinary mortals are cracked by it. So here, obviously, Marx is taking some time to defend his writing, which I think, as we will see, he does his best to really communicate and bring in literary references, bring in, great phrases from world literature, from mythology, everywhere, and I think does succeed at making a very difficult subject, very, very interesting and evocative. An excellent Russian translation of Capital appeared in the spring of 1872 in St. Petersburg. The edition of 3,000 copies is already nearly exhausted. As early as 1871, N. Sieber, professor of political economy at the University of Kiev, his work David Ricardo's Theory of Value and of Capital, referred to my theory of value, money, and capital as in its fundamentals a necessary sequel to the teaching of Smith and Ricardo. What astonishes a Western European when he reads this solid piece of work is the author's consistent and firm grasp of the purely theoretical position. That the method employed in Capital has been little understood is shown by the various mutually contradictory conceptions that have been formed of it. Thus, the Paris Revue Positiviste reproaches me for, on the one hand, treating economics metaphysically, and on the other hand, imagine this, confining myself merely to the critical analysis of the actual facts instead of writing recipes, promptest ones, for the cookshops of the future. Professor Sieber has already given the answer to the reproach about metaphysics. Insofar as it deals with actual theory, the method of Marx is the deductive method of the whole English school, a school whose failings and virtues are common to the best theoretical economists. Mr. M. Bloch in Les Neurosciences du Socialisme en Allemand, extrait du Journal des économistes, makes the discovery that my method is analytic and says, with this work, Monsieur Marx can be ranged among the most eminent analytical thinkers. The German reviewers, of course, cry out against my Hegelian sophistry. The European Messenger, Vishnek Europe of St. Petersburg, in an article dealing exclusively with the method of capital, finds my method of inquiry severely realistic, but my method of presentation, unfortunately, German dialectical. It says, at first sight, if the judgment is made on the basis of the external form of the presentation, Marx is the most idealist of philosophers, and indeed in the German, i.e., the bad sense of the word. But in point of fact, he is infinitely more realistic than all his predecessors in the business of economic criticism, and in no sense be called an idealist. I cannot answer the writer of this review in any better way than by quoting a few extracts from his own criticism, which may, apart from this, interest some of my readers for whom the Russian original is inaccessible. After a quotation from the preface to my Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, where I have discussed the materialist basis of my method, the reviewer goes on. The one thing which is important for Marx is to find the law of the phenomena, whose investigation he is concerned. And it is not only the law which governs these phenomena insofar as they have a definite form and mutual connection within a given historical period that is important to him. Of still greater importance to him is the law of their variation, of their development, i.e., of their transition from one form into another, from one series of connections into a different one. Once he has discovered this law, he investigates in detail the effects with which it manifests itself in social life. Consequently, Marx only concerns himself with one thing, to show, by an exact scientific investigation, the necessity of successive determinate orders of social relations, and to establish, as impeccably as possible, the facts from which he starts out and on which he depends. For this, it is quite enough if he proves, at the same time, both the necessity of the present order of things and the necessity of another order into which the first must inevitably pass over. And it is a matter of indifference whether men believe or do not believe, whether they are conscious of it or not. Marx treats the social movement as a process of natural history, governed by laws not only independent of human will, consciousness, and intelligence, rather, on the contrary, determining that will, consciousness, and intelligence. If the conscious element plays such a subordinate part in the history of civilization, self-evident that a critique whose object is civilization itself can, less than anything else, have for its basis any form or any result of consciousness. This means that it is not the idea, but only its external manifestation which can serve as the starting point. A critique of this kind will confine itself to the confrontation and comparison of a fact, not with ideas, but with another fact. The only things of importance for this inquiry are that the facts be investigated as accurately as possible, that they actually form different aspects of development vis-a-vis each other. Most important of all is the precise analysis of the series of successions, of the sequences and links within which the different stages of development present them. It will be said against this that the general laws of economic life are one and the same, no matter whether they are applied to the present or the past. But this is exactly what Marx denies. According to him, such abstract laws do not exist. On the contrary, in his opinion, every historical period possesses its own laws. As soon as life has passed through a given period of development and is passing over from one given stage to another, it begins to be subject also to other laws. In short, economic life offers us a phenomenon analogous to the history of evolution in other branches of biology. The old economists misunderstood the nature of economic laws when they likened them to the laws of physics and chemistry. A more thorough analysis of phenomena shows that social organisms differ among themselves as fundamentally as plants or animals. Indeed, one and the same phenomenon falls under quite different laws, in consequence of the different general structure of these organisms, variations of their individual organs, and the different conditions in which these organs function. Marx denies, for example, that the law of population is the same at all times and in all places. He asserts, on the contrary, that every stage of development has its own law of population, with the varying degrees of development of productive power, social conditions, and laws governing them vary too. While Marx sets himself the task of following and explaining the capitalist economic order from this point of view, he is only formulating in a strictly scientific manner the aim that every accurate investigation into economic life must have. The scientific value of such an inquiry lies in the illumination of the special laws that regulate the origin, existence, development, and death of a given social organism, and its replacement by another higher one. In fact, this is the value of Marx's book. Here, finally, we're back to Marx after a very extensive block quote over review. We will run across a number of these very long block quotes, which can be challenging at times. Returning to Marx. Here, the reviewer pictures what he takes to be my own actual method in a striking, and as far as concerns my own application of it, generous way. But what else is he depicting but the dialectical method? This is here we see the introduction of dialectical. This is it comes from Hegel, obviously, and Marx's own study information in the Hegelian school, and then him, stepping out of that and developing his own method, utilizing a lot of the techniques and logic built out of that. There could be an endless series on what is dialectic, what is dialectical. I would emphasize, however, I guess an important thing for Capital here is that Marx doesn't feel the need to use the term dialectical very much within Capital itself, and that's because he's going to demonstrate it. He's not going to say, you can run across this in a lot of what I consider to be not so great Marxist writing, particularly from some political organizations. Well, they'll have, they'll be trying to justify some past position they had, or some new political turn their organization is making, and they'll be like, well, we're consistent despite this change because we're thinking about things in a dialectical way, and you're not understanding, our adoption of dialectical methods for, directing the party. This tends to be a tremendous misuse of it, and this is obviously present very heavily in a lot of the works produced by the party bureaucracy in the later years of the Soviet Union and so forth. And one thing that I kind of want to emphasize is that Marx, for his most important work, he does especially here in this preface, he emphasizes that yes, he is applying a dialectical method to understanding capital and understanding the capitalist social mode of production and to building up this analysis and critique of it. However, in this book, he doesn't feel the need to use the term dialectical. And so if Marx can write Capital without having to appeal to the term all the time, I believe there are many political organizations that can manage to finish an article or two without using it to cover up their past mistakes or the logical inconsistencies of their latest maneuvers. So yeah, that's something that I feel is important to emphasize with Capital, is that he's absolutely applying a dialectical methodology and how he constructs all of the subsequent critique we're going to be working through, but he doesn't feel the need to use the term. He applies the method, and constructs the book utilizing the kind of knowledge frame of analysis that methodology enables for him. All right, miniature rant over, return to finishing up this. Of course, the method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. The later has to appropriate the material in detail to analyze its different forms of development and track down their interconnection. Only after this work has been done can the real movement be appropriately presented. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is now reflected back in the ideas, then it may appear as if we have before us an a priori construction. My dialectical method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he even transforms into an independent subject under the name of the idea, is the creator of the real world. The real world is only the external appearance of the idea. With me, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man, translated into forms of thought. So here we have, of course, the historic Marx himself explaining here the sort of turning of Hegel on his head, for which that's the famous phrase and interpretation is, Marx is turning Hegel on his head and placing a materialist perspective on it, where that is the center, which then produces the ideal. Though obviously there's interrelations between that, and you don't want to oversimplify it too much, but yeah. I criticized the mystificatory side of the Hegelian dialectic nearly 30 years ago, at a time when it was still the fashion. But just when I was working at the first volume of Capital, the ill-humored, arrogant, and mediocre epigones who now talk large in educated German circles began to take pleasure in treating Hegel in the same way as the good Moses Mendelssohn treated Spinoza in Lessing's time, namely as a dead dog. I therefore openly avowed myself the pupil of that mighty thinker, and even here and there in the chapter on the theory of value, coquetted with the mode of expression peculiar to him. The mystification which the dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being first to present its general forms of motion in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him, it is standing on its head. It must be inverted in order to discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. Obviously, another hugely famous phrase of Marx here, where he sort of summarizes that standing on its head and taking rational kernel from within. In its mystified form, the dialectic became the fashion in Germany, as it seemed to transfigure and glorify what exists. In its rational form, it is a scandal and an abomination to bourgeoisie and its doctrinaire spokesmen, because it includes in its positive understanding of what exists a simultaneous recognition of its negation, its inevitable destruction, because it regards every historically developed form as being in a fluid state, motion, and therefore grasps its transient aspect as well, and because it does not let itself be impressed by anything, being in its very essence critical and revolutionary. The fact that the movement of capitalist society is full of contradictions impresses itself most strikingly on the practical bourgeoisie changes of the periodic cycle through which modern industry passes, the summit of which is the general crisis. That crisis is once again approaching, although as yet it is only in its preliminary stages, and by the universality of its field of action and the intensity of its impact, it will drum dialectics even into the heads of the upstarts in charge of the new Holy Prussian German Empire. London, 24th of January, 1870. So yeah, here we have finished the preface, the postface to the second edition. And yeah, particularly these last couple pages where he's giving this summary of his transformation of Hegel's dialectic are very important and well referenced going forward, and basically all of Marxist literature and understanding where Marx is coming from, and in particular that emphasis on utilizing it as a methodology to see the transient nature of things and to understand things which are processes. One example that I tend to go to all the time is even you take like life or any complex process, you can you could attempt to freeze time and analyze exactly the position of every atom and every molecule and all the sort of tensions and forces, but that wouldn't necessarily let you understand well the process as a whole of how it acts in time, how it acts as an organism that is living, moving, changing, transforming. And that's why it's so important to understanding something like society, which is, a planetary organism, effectively. We're trying to grasp what is all of human society, working together, interrelated. We're dealing with grasping something that is beyond all possible measures of knowledge to try to have, an exact knowledge of where everything is down to the molecule. So we need a methodology that can try to see what are the processes within this, what are the sort of internal logics and transformations, how is it in conflict, how is it in conflict with itself, where can it potentially be going, and none of that necessarily gives us a definite answer. Like, he talks about a coming crisis then in 1873, and there was a very important crisis. Even in the United States, I believe it was 1877 that there was a very significant railway strike. And many of the red brick National Guard buildings that are spread across the United States came out of this period in which sectors of the American working class basically rose up with arms, against how things were going in the United States. But it's difficult to know, X is going to be a definitive crisis or the definitive crisis. What we can look to is try to understand the processes that lead to crisis. What are the logics behind this, and how can we expect to see that repeated and transformed? And what are some of the logics within that could potentially point to, a new mode of production, a new way of organizing society that can come afterwards, similarly to how capitalism itself was a new mode of production, something that emerged out of feudalism and other tributary modes of production, and which could only emerge on the basis of what they had done. It's not that you could just project capitalism back to the beginning of history. Capitalism to emerge required a whole series of material foundations in terms of, the possibility of global commerce, the technology to support that, the development of metallurgy. Like, you couldn't build a steam engine without having developed metallurgy to the kind of high levels that it had been pushed in many ways by, even things like armor production in the late Middle Ages. There was a growth in metallurgical skills driven by that, driven by cannons, all the different areas where there was advances in metallurgical science, which then would make it possible for different technologies to evolve, and like many of those other aspects that were fundamental for having a place for this capital reinvested and to transform into this kind of circular, self-fulfilling process. All right, we have a few shorter prefaces, thankfully. So let's go through those. This is the preface to the French edition. Citizen Maurice my French is terrible. I shouldn't even try, but To Citizen Maurice. Dear citizen, I applaud your idea of publishing the translation of Capital as a serial. In this form, the book will be more accessible to the working class, consideration which to me outweighs everything else. Here, we can say we are doing our own work to republish Capital as a live stream and as a VOD afterwards, and in that way are attempting to make it more accessible to the working class. And Marx here, important thing again is that he's trying to get this knowledge into his hands, workers' hands. And as I mentioned before, that involved people reading it out of order, and involved carrying up pieces of capital, trading it between different workers in a group, and then coming together to discuss it how they could. So for Marx, the important thing is not how you do read Capital, or that you do it as part of a graduate seminar, or that you do it in this regimented academic way. He wants the knowledge to be accessible and to infuse the working class and to help us to understand our world, how it works, and how we can eventually go beyond it. Though he won't say much about the later in this, but obviously understanding the social logic of the current world is essential to that. That is the good side of your suggestion, but here is the reverse of the medal. The method of analysis which I have employed, and which had not previously been applied to economic subjects, makes the reading of the first chapters rather arduous. And it is to be feared that the French public, always impatient to come to a conclusion, eager to know the connection between general principles and the immediate questions that have aroused their passions, may be disheartened because they will be unable to move on at once. That is a disadvantage I am powerless to overcome, unless it be by forewarning and forearming those readers who zealously seek the truth. There is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. Believe me, dear citizen, your devoted Karl Marx. So here he is advising us once again that there are parts that will be difficult, and in particular, the first chapters will be extra difficult, which is part of what scares people off. Lots of the book is much more historical, or has a sort of more literary flow, but the first chapters on the commodity and building out of that will be difficult. They will be a fatiguing climb. And Marx is letting us know to be aware of that. Postface to the French edition. To the reader, Mr. J. Roy set himself the task of producing a version that would be as exact and even literal as possible. Scrupulously fulfilled it, but his very scrupulousness has compelled me to modify his text, with a view to rendering it more intelligible to the reader. These alterations, introduced from day to day, as the book was published in parts, were not made with equal care and were bound to result in a lack of harmony and style. Having once undertaken this work of revision, I was led to apply it also to the basic original text, the second German edition. To simplify some arguments, to complete others, give additional historical or statistical material, to add critical suggestions, etc. Hence, whatever the literary defects of this French edition may, this is a scientific value independent of the original, should be consulted even by readers familiar with German. Below, I give the passages in the postface to the second German edition, which treat of the development of political economy in Germany and the method employed in the present work. All right. This one more, not as much important to grab out of. On to the preface to the third edition. There are Marx was not destined to get this, the third edition, ready for the press himself. The powerful thinker, to whose greatness even his opponents now make obeisance, died on 14th of March, 1884. Upon me, who in Marx lost the best, the truest friend I had, and had for 40 years, a friend who I am more indebted than expressed in words, upon me now devolved the duty of attending to the publication of this third edition, as well as of the second volume which Marx had left behind in manuscript. I must now account here to the reader for the way in which I discharged the first part of my duty. So this preface is obviously Engels coming in afterwards, having edited and reworked again and again many of the notes into what would be the definitive edition of Capital and volumes 2 and 3. It was Marx's original intention to rewrite a great part of the text of the first volume, formulate many theoretical points more exactly, to insert new ones, and to bring historical and statistical materials up to date. But his ailing condition and the urgent need to do the final editing of the second volume induced him to give up this. Only the most necessary alterations were to be made, only the insertions which the French edition, the Capital par Karl Marx, already contained were to be put in. Among the books left by Marx, there was a German copy which he himself had corrected here and there and provided with reference to the French edition. Also, a French copy in which he had indicated the exact passages. These alterations and additions are confined, with few exceptions, to part 7 of the book, entitled Process of Accumulation of Capital. Here, the previous text followed the original draft more closely than elsewhere, while the preceding sections had been gone over more thoroughly. Style was therefore more vivacious, more of a single cast, but also more careless, studded with Anglicisms and in parts unclear. There were gaps here and there in the presentation of arguments, some important particulars being merely alluded. With regard to the style, Marx had himself thoroughly revised several subsections, and had thereby indicated to me here, as well as in numerous oral suggestions, the length to which I could go in eliminating English technical terms and other Anglicisms. Marx would in any event have gone over the additions and supplementary texts and have replaced the smooth French with his own terse German. I had to be satisfied when transferring them with bringing them into maximum harmony with the original text. Thus, not a single word was changed in this third edition without my firm conviction that the author would have altered it himself. It would never occur to me to introduce into Capital the current jargon in which German economists are wont to express themselves, that gibberish in which, for instance, one who has others give him their labor for cash is called a labor giver, Arbeitergeber, and one whose labor is taken away from him for wages is called a labor taker, Arbeitnehmer. In French, too, the word travail, and my French is bad, is used in everyday life in the sense of occupation. But the French would rightly consider any economist crazy should he call the capitalist a donneur de travail, labor giver, or the worker a receveur de travail, labor taker. Here we're having a discussion on job creators, some of those phrases. Hey, Roastbeef, yes indeed. Welcome to the future. We have to make capital available however we can. In the old days, this meant carrying it up and sharing it among workers. Today, it means me reading it aloud across Twitch and YouTube. Nor have I taken the liberty of converting the English coins and money, weights and measures used throughout the text into their new German equivalents. This is not going to apply to us. Obviously, we're reading English, so many of these initial comments are they're specific to the German edition. However, he is going to, in a bit, talk a bit more broadly. When the first edition appeared, there were as many kinds of weights and measures in Germany as there are days in the year. Apart from this, there were two kinds of mark. The Reichsmark only existed at the time in the imagination of Sothbyr, but invented it in the late 30s. Two kinds of guilder, and at least three kinds of thaler, including one called the Neues Zweidrittel. Here is a footnote, new 2/3. Silver coin worth 2/3 of a thaler, circulated in a number of German principalities between 17th and 19th centuries. For those who do not know, obviously German here was coming out of, its time as the Holy Roman Empire, where it was divided into innumerable different principalities and mini states. If you go up and look at a map at what the Holy Roman Empire looked like, it is quite shocking and gives you a bit of a view into just how distinct and different feudalism was, and the feudal concept of community and of what we'd consider something timeless like the nation was back then. And yeah, Marx was writing and coming into history at a period where that was disappearing and being consolidated into what we know as Germany today, precisely as part of that process of consolidation capitalist nation state, which needed, for capitalism to flourish, needed one set of measures. It's hard to run a business if every city has its own way of measuring. It's hard enough community America and the rest of the world these days, where Americans use pounds and gallons and all that. Everyone else uses the metric system because it's insane. But imagine if there are hundreds of differences. So to have an effective economy, you have to have one system of measurements. You also basically have to have one language in contracts to write up contracts, to make agreements that can, and ultimately one state that is capable of enforcing the contracts and across those spaces. And that is why modern nation state, as we understand that, is something that incredibly new historically, and tendency of many people national that relationship back to history. Turks will be talking about the glories of the Ottoman Empire, this idea of French nation. But in reality, like if you look at France and ages, you had like Burgundy, at Brittany, where they spoke an entirely different language. It was after the French Revolution that it properly as a whole, and that required significant effort from above to achieve that, particularly across the countryside. The natural sciences, the metric system prevailed. The world market, under such circumstances, quite natural for a book actual exclusively last name, especially as the corresponding can get hardly English weights measures entirely particularly in cotton. And words on Marx's so little. They are pure state fact or. Oh, I am dropping in and out every other word. Oh no. For advising me of that. Let me do have the yes. Thank you. This is why it's good to do the preface first. So when we get to the actual text, that's let me probably need to that on maximum there, and or I just need to be closer. Maybe that's it. I think I was stepping back a bit too much. And now it seems like it's counting everything. All right, so I have to be close to the mic for it to work. All right, using as my bookmark here, 100 pesos, Argentinian pesos. In conclusion, a few words on Marx's manner of quoting, which is so little understood. When they are pure statements of fact or descriptions, the quotations from the English Blue Books, for example, serve, of course, as simple documentary proof. But this is not so when the theoretical views of other economists are cited. Here, the quotation is intended merely to state where, when, and by whom an economic idea conceived in the course of development was first clearly enunciated. Here, the only consideration is that the economic conception in question must be of some significance to the history of the science, that it is the more or less adequate theoretical expression of the economic situation of its time. But whether this conception still possesses any absolute or relative validity from the standpoint of the author, or whether it has already become wholly past history, is quite immaterial. Hence, those quotations are only a running commentary to the text, a commentary borrowed from the history of economic science. They establish the dates and originators of certain of the more important advances in economic theory. And that was a very necessary thing in a science whose historians have so far distinguished themselves only by the tendentious ignorance characteristic of place hunters. It will now be understood why Marx, in consonance with the Post-Vista second edition, only had occasion to quote German economists in very exceptional cases. There is hope that the second volume will appear in the course of 1884. All right. Paper money, fake. Well, I suppose so. There's an interesting discussion to be had there later, because he does actually, it talks about the emergence of gold as a sort of world currency, and there is some work to be done to understand how capitalism evolved post gold standard into this crazy American dominated system where America just says, yeah, we have our money, you'll use it. And everyone uses it because, well, everyone wants to get on the New York Stock Exchange and puts their investments in treasury bonds. But yeah, that will be when we get to the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, which is significantly after this text. So I don't think we will get there with the reading of Capital, at least. All right, we have another preface. This one is a little shorter, and then we have another preface after that one. So this is basically the preface stream. Preface to the English edition. The publication of an English version of Das Kapital needs no apology. On the contrary, an explanation might be expected why this English version has been delayed until now. Seeing that for some years past, the theories advocated in this book have been constantly referred to, attacked and defended, interpreted and misinterpreted in the periodical press and the current literature of both England and America. So yeah, Marx was being attacked in his own day. It's not just today and after the Red Scare that they attack Marxism. Right from the start, had plenty of hate for saying things how they are. When, soon after the author's death in 1883, it became evident that an English edition of the work was really required, Mr. Samuel Moore, for many years a friend of Marx and of the present writer, and then whom, perhaps, no one is more conversant with the book itself, consented to undertake the translation which the literary executors of Marx were anxious to lay before the public. It was understood that I should compare the manuscript with the original work and suggest such alterations as I might deem advisable. When, by and by, it was found that Mr. Moore's professional occupations prevented him from finishing the translation as quickly as we all desired, we gladly accepted Dr. Aveling's offer to undertake a portion of the work, At the same time, Miss Aveline, Marx's youngest daughter, offered to check the quotations and to restore the original text of the numerous passages taken from English authors and the blue books and translated by Marx into German. This has been done throughout, with but a few unavoidable exceptions. The following portions of the book have been translated by Dr. Aveling. This is not important. We will skip this part for a little bit. All of the rest of the book has been done by Mr. Moore. While thus each of the translators is responsible for his share of the work only, I bear a joint responsibility for the whole. The third German edition, which has been made the basis of our work throughout, was prepared by me in 1883 with the assistance of notes left by the author, indicating the passages of the second edition to be replaced by designated passages from the French text published in 1873. Here is a footnote, again referring to Le Capital by Karl Marx. This translation, especially in the later part of the book, contains considerable alterations and additions to the text of the second German edition. So here it's talking about something that's been mentioned that you can also find when Marxologists, people who study Marx, talk about the evolution of capital. Like there was the first edition, the second German edition, then there was the French edition, which introduced new things. Marx couldn't complete the incorporation of some of those new things into the newer German edition that was released afterwards, which was released by Engels. And so there had to be a little bit of work by Engels to sort of transfuse those innovations from French into the newer German edition. And then, well, of course, all of that then had to be retranslated back into, or had to be then translated into English again, which was its own process. And there are a few different translations of Marx's Capital that you can find. The public domain one is the one being referred to in this preface. And this one is the Penguin one, which is probably the one that's most commonly, which you can find online pretty easily as well. And it's the one you're going to find a physical copy of most easily. There is a new edition that was released, I think, like last year or the year before, maybe. That's a new translation of Capital, which is I've heard is fairly good, but there are some differences between them. And depending on what you're looking for, I think they made there was a Japanese author who made a manga version of Capital that I think has like a fishing factory where things are taking place, which we will have to look into in the future. That'll maybe be easier on my voice to go through the manga version of Capital. All right. For German edition, the alterations thus affected in the text of the second edition generally coincide with changes prescribed by Marx in a set of manuscript instructions for an English translation that was planned about 10 years ago in America, but abandoned for want of a fit and proper translator. This manuscript was placed at our disposal by our old friend, Mr. Sorge of Hoboken, New Jersey. Hey, something good coming out of New Jersey. I don't usually hear about good things from New Jersey. You only hear bad things about New Jersey these days. But who knew that it was the home of an important supporter of Marx and Engels? It designates some future interpolations from the French edition, but being so many years older than the final instructions for the third edition, I did not consider myself at liberty to make use of it otherwise than sparingly, and chiefly in cases where it helped us over difficulties. In the same way, the French text has been referred to in most of the difficult passages as an indicator of what the author himself was prepared to sacrifice, wherever something of the full import of the original had to be sacrificed in the rendering. So more questions of editing. As someone who works as an editor, I can tell you it's painful. It's a painful job. And then you have to convince the author, no, you don't really need this and that. And the other thing, we need to make this successful, you have to explain here, and then they don't want to. And I can't imagine how challenging being an editor for Marx was. There is, however, one difficulty we could not spare the reader. Again, advising readers that hard times are to come at the beginning of this book. The use of certain terms in a sense different from what they have not only in common life, but in ordinary political economy. But this was unavoidable. Every new aspect of a science involves a revolution in the technical terms of that science. This is best shown by chemistry, where the whole of the terminology is radically changed about once in 20 years, and where you will hardly find a single organic compound that has not gone through a whole series of different names. Political economy has generally been content to take, just as they were, the terms of commercial and industrial life, and to operate with them, entirely failing to see that by so doing it confined itself within the narrow circle of ideas expressed by those terms. Thus, though perfectly aware that both profits and rent are but subdivisions, fragments of that unpaid part of the product which the laborer has to supply to his employer, first appropriator but not its ultimate exclusive owner, yet even classical political economy never went beyond the received notions of profits and rents, never examined this unpaid part of the product called by Marx surplus product. In its integrity as a whole, and therefore never arrived at a clear comprehension either of its origin and nature or of the laws that regulate the subsequent distribution of its value. Similarly, all industry, not agriculture or handicraft, is indiscriminately comprised in the term of manufacture, and thereby the distinction is obliterated between two great and essentially different periods of economic history. The period of manufacture proper, based on the division of manual labor, and the period of modern industry based on machinery. It is, however, self-evident that a theory which views modern capitalist production as a mere passing stage in the economic history of mankind must make use of terms different from those habitual to writers who look upon that form of production as imperishable and final. So here again, we're seeing the importance of, if you need another terminology if you don't see the aspects and values and functioning of capitalism as something universal that has always been there, in which is a view in which much of human history appears like, whoa, well, it was just irrational, why did the Romans have a slave system? Why did feudalism emerge after the Roman Empire? It doesn't make sense. They were just impeding the natural logic of entrepreneurship and the market economy that is the universal law of human productivity and progress. That's not a view that stands up historically. And so, and with it is a sort of presumption, of course, of, reading that into the future. Current capitalist social relations are not always going to be around. And, Marx doesn't demonstrate exactly what things surpassing that could be, or that, obviously he is staking himself politically on, workers taking collective control of the means of production, and that is something that is an action with its own proper logic within the system itself and within the processes generated by that system and within its contradictions. But obviously that is a grander political statement as well. And here Marx is emphasizing that, beyond whatever political objective or prediction you may put on how things will be surpassed, it is not sustainable to see the current capitalist social relations as these supposedly eternal laws of human nature. Because, anyone who studied history, you quickly see, you look into how, I don't know, Byzantium worked in the 8th century, or, how things were organized in Athens, or how things were organized in Rome, or the different sort of absolutist monarchies. You can see this tremendous diversity of social organization and of values in which, it's not viable to sort of read these supposed infinite laws of human nature and market relationships as being practical in any ways. And And that is, the sort of Marxist analysis of human nature, and this is brought up all the time, like, oh yeah, that's a nice idea, but you can't do it because of human nature. The Marxist conception of human nature is that human nature is moldable, that human nature corresponds to how we relate, to how we produce our own sustenance, how we produce the things how we produce the things we want, and that human nature is something that we shape and define collectively. Um, so, ironically enough, it's generally the partisans of capitalism that are putting forward a their own idealized form of human nature in which they read this eternal, unshakable human nature, which is supposedly corresponds to a capitalist mode of production and to rational self-interest, et cetera, et cetera. Which again, if you read history, is like plainly not the case. Reading back into history, how things worked before, even looking at, how other ruling classes acted. If you were a feudal lord, yes, you wanted to accumulate the most you could in terms of taxes, in terms of extracting surplus. But where did you put that surplus that you extracted? It wasn't necessarily in investing. It was often in throwing feasts to gain support among the aristocracy, or luxury items to show your nobility and grandeur, to demonstrate that you were truly a worthy noble in court of the aristocracy and all of that. And that is ultimately it's a social logic that corresponds to some aspects that have been sort of subsumed into capitalism today, but it's also a social logic that is distinct in its own way, even within a distinct ruling class social logic, where that surplus was extracted and used in a way to pursue other objectives than necessarily like reinvestment into productive technology, or reinvestment into capital in the way that capitalism functions today. So even within ruling elites, like, you can't read this eternal picture of supposed human nature. Human nature is something that we shape as we interact with nature, and it's shaped by our relationship between ourselves and nature. And our relationship between ourselves and nature is a collective relationship between each other. And so there is no presupposition within Marxism that, human nature is inherently good or inherently this or that. Human nature is shaped by how we relate to the world, and as our ability to impact the world grows, and as the importance of taking a sort of collective management of the scale of that impact, which is obviously being affected on a planetary scale in a way that Marx couldn't even imagine then. That demonstrates the importance of beginning to take a sort of collective consciousness over that impact, and shape how we relate to that, and how we can mold that, and how we can have a sort of triumph of self-consciousness over those elements. All right. With that digression on human nature, which is always necessary with these kind of discussions. A word respecting, a word respecting the author's method of quoting may not be out of place. In the majority of cases, the quotations serve in the usual way as documentary evidence in support of assertions made in the text. But in many instances, passages from economic writers are quoted in order to indicate when, where, and by whom a certain proposition was for the first time clearly enunciated. This is done in cases where the proposition quoted is of importance as being a more or less adequate expression of the conditions of social production and exchange prevalent at the time, and quite irrespective of Marx's recognition or otherwise of its general validity. These quotations therefore supplement the text by a running commentary taken from the history of the science. So here again, like, where he's quoting, it's not always, that's not necessarily his argument itself. It is something that is more important actually in some of his earlier texts, and especially some of his texts that weren't meant to be published in the first place. If you look at some of the writings of the early Marx, there are often extensive periods where he'll build up a series of arguments, sentences, where it is him reconstructing an argument that he's then going to debate within or against. And this becomes a problem because a lot of people then like take that quote out of context and are like, "Oh wow, look what Marx said here." But what he was actually doing was, summarizing an argument that he was then going to argue against, and trying to do that in a way that sort of accurately, semi-accurately reflects, the argument he's building his own argument against. Our translation comprises the first book of the work only, but this first book is in a great measure a whole in itself, and has for 20 years ranked as an independent work. The second book, edited in German by me in 1885, is decidedly incomplete without the third, which cannot be published before the end of 1887. When Book 3 has been brought out in the original German, it will then be soon enough to think about preparing an English edition of both. Again, Volume 2 and Volume 3 had to be prepared by Engels after Marx's death. Volume 2 is very difficult. Volume 2, I think it talks about the circulation of capital, and so he talks a lot more about, there are a lot more mathematical equations that come up in it, so it's a harder one to work through. But we will cross that bridge when we get there. Capital is often called on the continent the Bible of the working class. That the conclusions arrived at in this work are daily more and more becoming the fundamental principles of the great working class movement, not only in Germany and Switzerland, but in France, in Holland and Belgium, in America, and even in Italy and Spain, that everywhere the working class more and more recognizes in these conclusions the most adequate expression of its condition and of its aspirations. Nobody acquainted with that movement will deny. And in England, too, the theories of Marx, even at this moment, exercise a powerful influence upon the socialist movement, which is spreading in the ranks of cultured people, no less than those of the working class. But that is not all. The time is rapidly approaching when a thorough examination of England's economic position will impose itself as an irresistible national necessity. The working of the industrial system of this country, impossible without a constant and rapid extension of production, and therefore of markets, is coming to a dead stop. Free trade has exhausted its resources. Even Manchester doubts this, its quondam economic gospel. Here, another footnote. At the quarterly meeting of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce held this afternoon, a warm discussion took place on the subject of free trade. A resolution was moved to the effect that, having waited in vain 40 years for other nations to follow the free trade example of England, this chamber thinks the time has now arrived to reconsider that position. The resolution was rejected by a majority of 1 only, the figures being 21 for and 22 against. Returning to the main text, foreign industry rapidly developing stares English production in the face everywhere, not only in the protected but also in neutral markets, even on this side of the channel. While the productive power increases in a geometric ratio, the extension of markets proceeds at best in an arithmetic one. The decennial cycle of stagnation, prosperity, overproduction, and crises, ever recurrent from 1825 to 1867, seems indeed to have run its course, but only to land us in the slough of despond of a permanent and chronic depression. The sighed for period of prosperity will not come. As often as we seem to perceive its heralding symptoms, so often do they again vanish into air. Meanwhile, each succeeding winter brings up afresh the great question: what to do with the unemployed? While the number of the unemployed keeps swelling from year to year, there is nobody to answer that question. And we can almost calculate the moment when the unemployed, losing patience, will take their own fate into their own hands. Surely at such a moment, the voice ought to be heard of a man whose whole theory is the result of a lifelong study of the economic history and condition of England, and whom that study led to the conclusion that, at least in Europe, England is the only country where the inevitable social revolution might be effected entirely by peaceful and legal means. He certainly never forgot to add that he hardly expected the English ruling classes to submit without a pro-slavery rebellion to this peaceful and legal revolution. So here is a part that was kind of taken taken a little partly out of context in some future writings, but it did provide a precedent that some people within the socialist movement, like Bernstein in Germany, who would sort of advocate a sort of reformist gradual passage from capitalism to socialism, took as a precedent here from this preface and from a few other older writings of Engels as well. And obviously, there are a few things here that didn't quite work out. Obviously, Engels here is, as often happened to Marx and Engels, they're like, yes, the crisis is finally arriving. This is finally the crisis where we tear down the system. And unfortunately, the system proves to have the political capabilities to maintain itself, to withstand this economic crisis, to deflect the anger of the working class, and to recompose itself often on the basis of new areas of exploitation and new areas of capitalist growth. And yes, as Quigley puts it, to make us pay for it. In these cases with different waves of unemployment, obviously making employed pay for it. And of course, most importantly, the dynamics being pointed out here, where Engels is talking about the sort of decline of free trade, even within England, corresponds to what was coming in this period. This is obviously 1886, but you could already see some of the economic dynamics evolving, which would lead to the First World War. Where competition between England and between new industrial powers like Germany, all of that would culminate in a truly brutal and inhumane war on a scale that had never been seen before, and which then got to happen again 20 years afterwards with another cycle around World War II, which was combined tremendous devastation on unprecedented scales, and which set the stage ultimately for the emergence of an American hegemony over the capitalist world system, and the sort of post-World War II system, which we still live in today, even as we live in the era of its decline and weakness, but of a world capitalist system dominated and defined by United States, which has come to play on a world scale much of the kind of role that England once played on, they played on the world scale, of course, but more in depth in the European scale, where England had this island that was unassailable by its foreign enemies, effectively, and maintained itself principally with avoiding the emergence of any strong continental competitor that would threaten them. And the United States has the world's biggest island, the Americas, as its special zone where no one can really challenge it within that, and it dedicates itself quite actively to maintaining a division of the of the world system. And in particular, over a long period, they've tried to maintain a sort of disunity across Eurasia, maintain their own control of the Middle East, but it is starting to break down. And so we will see in the coming years what things look like after the breakdown of that system. Now, we have one more preface here. It is a somewhat shorter one. Well, not shorter than the last one. It's 6-7 pages. So we will go through this, the final preface to the 4th edition. And then it will be the text itself, after which we probably wait to dive into the text itself for the next stream next Sunday. All right, preface to the fourth edition. Fourth edition required that I should establish in final form as nearly as possible both text and footnotes. The following brief explanation will show how I have fulfilled this task. Again, this is going to be a bit of technical challenges of being an editor, but I identify with these challenges. I have to edit academic Marxist texts all the time, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of oh no, wait, I have to correct this footnote, I have to change that. Is that reference right? Is it the right year there? After again comparing the French edition and Marx's manuscript remarks, I have made some further additions to the German text from that translation. It will be found on page 212, page 624 to 6, page 730 to 4, 777 to 80, and on page 7083 in note 13. I have also followed the example of the French and English editions by putting the long footnote on the minors into the text. Other small alterations are of a purely technical nature. Further, I have added a few more explanatory notes, especially where changed historical conditions seem to demand this. All these additional notes are enclosed in square brackets and marked either with my initials or D.H. In the meantime, a complete revision of the numerous quotations have been made necessary by the publication of the English edition. For this edition, Marx's youngest daughter, Eleanor, undertook to compare all the quotations with their originals, so that those taken from English sources, which constitute the vast majority, are given there not as retranslations from the German, but in the original English form. This is something I come across a lot as an editor and translator too, is a lot of work when you have to do that, because you, especially with these academic texts, there's a lot of block quotes, and then it's like, okay, well, we could just retranslate the translation, but no, we have to go in to every source quoted here and then check it against the original, replace it with the original, see if it fits. It's painful. No one dare say that Engels and Marx did not work. That's a right-wing talking point that you hear a lot. I would like to see those people write a book of this size. A book that you could beat someone to death with the size and thickness of this book. I would like to see them achieve a work of political economy that does that, and then they can go and talk about how Marx didn't have a job. In preparing the fourth edition, it was therefore incumbent upon me to consult this text. The comparison revealed various small inaccuracies, page numbers wrongly indicated, owing partly to mistakes in copying from notebooks, partly to misprints, misplaced quotations, omission marks, which cannot be avoided when a mass of quotations is copied from notebook extracts. Here and there, some rather unhappy translation of a word, particular passages quoted from the old Paris notebooks of 1843 to 5, when Marx did not know English, was reading English economists and French translations. Interesting. I didn't know that he learned English so late, which is doubly impressive, because it's hard to learn other languages, especially at 1843, 1845. I think he was already in his 30s, early 30s maybe. So yeah, he had to learn English quite late, and then became masterful at it, and masterful at deploying Shakespeare and doing in-depth historical research into huge piles of statistics that were available there, and very, very difficult to do. I'm trying to learn languages myself all the time, and it's hard. I learned Spanish living here in Argentina, but then learning other languages to expand what you can study academically, it's going to take years to get anywhere. But anyone who compares the fourth edition with the previous ones can convince himself that all this laborious process of emendation has not produced the smallest change in the book worth speaking of. There was only one quotation which could not be traced, the one from Richard Jones. Marx probably slipped up when writing down the title of the book. This quotation subsequently was in fact later successfully traced. cited as part of the First International and after as part of the Pelican Marx Library. So it was found eventually. 100 years later, we found the missing quote. All the other quotations retain their cogency in full or have had their cogency enhanced by being put into the present exact form. Here, however, I am obliged to revert to an old story. I know of only one case in which the accuracy of a quotation given by Marx has been called in question, but as the issue dragged on beyond his lifetime, I cannot well ignore it here. On 7th March 1872, there appeared in the Berlin Concordia, organ of the Association of German Manufacturers, an anonymous article entitled How Karl Marx Quotes. It was asserted there, with an excessive display of moral indignation and unparliamentary language, that the quotation from Gladstone's budget speech of 16 April 1863 had been falsified, that not a single word of the sentence, that this intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power is entirely confined to classes of property, was to be found in the semi-official stenographic report in Hansard. But this sentence is nowhere to be found in Gladstone's speech. Exactly the opposite is stated there. In bold type, this sentence, both in form and substance, is a lie inserted by Marx. Marx, to whom this issue of Concordia was sent the following May, answered the anonymous offer in the Volksstadt of June 1st. As he could not recall which newspaper report he had used for the quotation, he limited himself to citing first the equivalent quotation from 2 English publications and then the report in the Times, according to which Gladstone says, man, some water before another quote. That is the state of the case as regards the wealth of this country. I must say, for one, I should really do like an evil English accent here, but I don't have the talent for it. So you'll have to forgive me there. I should look almost with apprehension and pain upon this intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power. If it were my belief that it was confined to classes who are in easy circumstances, this takes no cognizance at all of the condition of the laboring population. The augmentation I have described and which is founded, I think, upon accurate returns, is an augmentation entirely confined to classes possessed of property. Thus, Gladstone says here that he would be sorry if this were so, but it is so. This intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power is entirely confined to classes of property. And as for the semi-official Hansard, Marx goes on to say, in the version he manipulated afterwards, Mr. Gladstone was astute enough to obliterate this passage, which, coming from an English chancellor of the Esquire, was certainly compromising. This, by the way, is a traditional custom in the English Parliament, and not an invention got up by little Lasker against Babel. So here he is emphasizing that it's a good English tradition to lie, basically. And the footnote talks about in the Reichstag sitting of 8th of November 1871, the National Liberal Deputy declared in the course of a speech against the Social Democrat Bebel, who in this time was, basically the Marxist representative within the German equivalent of Parliament. If the German, and this is the Liberal Deputy declaring that if the German workers tried to follow the example of the Paris Commune, the honest propertied citizens would beat them to death with cudgels. But in the stenographic report, he had the words, beat them to death with cudgels, replaced with hold them down with their own strength. Bebel immediately revealed that this was a falsification. So, yeah, just change the record, strike out when the bourgeoisie is a little too honest about things. This is also why the bourgeoisie is, and certain state figures in the United States, they get upset with Trump so much because he says things like that. Like, it's not like literally, but he's basically saying the quiet part out loud all the time and really revealing U.S. imperialism as it really is to the world, without a pretty face and pretty words covering things up and changing things subsequently to have the tact of not saying what they like to openly threaten in their more heated moments. The anonymous writer gets angry and angrier. In his rejoinder in the Concordia 4th July, he sweeps aside secondhand sources and demurely suggests that it is the custom to quote parliamentary speeches from the stenographic report, adding, however, that the report in the Times which includes the supposedly falsified sentence, and the report in Hansard, which omits it, are substantially in complete agreement, and also that the report in the Times contains the exact opposite to that notorious passage in the inaugural address. Fellow carefully conceals the fact that the report in the Times explicitly includes the selfsame notorious passage, side by side with its alleged opposite. Despite all this, however, the anonymous writer feels that he is stuck fast and that he can only save himself by some new dodge. Thus, although his article bristles, as we have just shown, with impudent mendacity, and is interladed with such edifying terms of abuse as bad faith, dishonesty, lying allegation, that spurious quotation, impudent mendacity, a quotation entirely falsified, this falsification, simply infamous, etc., he finds it necessary to divert the issue to another domain, and therefore promises to explain in a second article the meaning which we, the non-mendacious anonymous one, attribute to the content of Gladstone's words, as if his particular opinion, unauthoritative as it is, had anything whatever to do with the matter. So, yeah, obviously in Marx and Engels' own times, they had their equivalents of, Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson and Asmongold or whoever else, taking things wildly out of context or making up claims that something is false, and then you demonstrate it's not false, but knowing the news cycle has already gone past it, and so there's just like this lingering memory. Oh yeah, you said something wrong, right? It was disproved by X. These people have been around for a while. Back then, they had to do it in the printed form, so there would be a record afterward. But it's certainly a practice that continues today to try to discredit socialists and Marxists. Marx replied in the Volksstadt of August 7th, now giving in addition the reports of the passage in question from the Morning Star and Morning Advertiser of April 17th, 1863. According to both reports, Gladstone said that he would look with apprehension, etc., upon this intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power if he believed it to be confined to classes in easy circumstances. But this augmentation was, in fact, he said, entirely confined to classes possessed of property. So these reports, too, reproduced word for word the sentence alleged to have been lyingly inserted. Marx further established once more by comparing texts in the Times and in Hansard that this sentence, with three newspaper reports of identical content appearing independently of one another the next morning, proved to have been really uttered, was missing from the Hansard report, revised according to the familiar custom, and that Gladstone, to use Marx's words, had afterwards conjured it away. Wouldn't it be nice for Trump if he could just, conjure? I suppose that is the advantage of video, is that Trump goes on and proclaims something, he puts something out on Twitter, and it's there. It's harder to, just erase it. Can you imagine if like everything said was reported through a newspaper today? They would change everything he says basically. There would be a lot of revisions going on to not say things in so naked and brutal a way as they tend to come out. In conclusion, Marx stated that he had no time to enter into any further discussions with the anonymous one. The letter also seems to have had enough. At any rate, Marx received no further issues of Concordia. With this matter appeared to be dead and buried, true, once or twice later on there reached us from persons in touch with the University of Cambridge mysterious rumors of an unspeakable literary crime which Marx was supposed to have committed in capital. But despite all investigation, nothing more definite could be learned. Here is the sort of lingering rumors that, sit there even after it's been disproven. Then, on 29th of November 1883, 8 months after Marx's death, there appeared in the Times a letter headed Trinity College, Cambridge, and signed Sedley Taylor, in which this little man who dabbles in the mildest sort of cooperative activity seized upon some chance pretext or other to enlighten us at last, not only about those vague Cambridge rumors, but also about the anonymous fellow in the Concordia. What appears extremely singular, says the little man from Trinity College, is that it was reserved for Professor Brentano, then of the University of Breslau, now of that of Strasbourg, to expose the bad faith which had manifestly dictated the citation made from Mr. Gladstone's speech in the inaugural address. Herr Karl Marx, who attempted to defend the citation, had the hardihood in the deadly shifts to which Brentano's masterly conduct of the attack speedily reduced him to assert that Mr. Gladstone had manipulated the report of his speech in the Times of April 17th before it appeared in Hansard in order to obliterate a passage which was certainly compromising for an English Chancellor of the Esquire. On Brentano's showing by a detailed comparison of texts that the reports of the Times and of Hansard agreed in utterly excluding the meaning which craftily isolated quotation had put upon Mr. Gladstone's words, Marx withdrew from further controversy under the plea of want of time. So that was the bottom of the whole business, and thus was the anonymous campaign of Herr Brentano and the Concordia gloriously reflected in the imagination of the producers' cooperatives of Cambridge. There he stood, sword in hand, and thus he battled in his masterly conduct of the attack, this St. George of the Association of German Manufacturers, while the infernal dragon Marx, in deadly shifts, speedily breathed his last at it. Again, wonderful writing by Engels here. Wonderful use of satire, which is something we will see at a number of other points in Capital that Marx himself will deploy. A battle scene worthy of Ariosto, but the whole thing only served to conceal the further dodges of our St. George. Here there is no longer talk of line insertion or falsification, but of craftily isolated quotation. The whole issue was shifted, and St. George and his Cambridge shield-bearer were very well aware why they had done this. Eleanor Marx replied in the monthly journal Today, February 1884, as the Times refused to publish her letter. She once more focused the debate on the sole question: had Marx lyingly inserted that sentence or not? To this, Mr. Sedley Taylor answered that the question whether a particular sentence did or did not occur in Mr. Gladstone's speech had been, in his opinion, of very subordinate importance in the Brentano-Marx controversy. Again, like once proven wrong, they immediately go, oh no, that wasn't really an important thing. He then admits that the report in the Times contained a verbal contrariety, but if the context is rightly interpreted, i.e. in the Gladstonian liberal sense, it shows what Mr. Gladstone meant to say. The most comic point here is that our little Cambridge man now insists upon quoting the speech not from Hansard, as, according to the anonymous Brentano, it is customary to do, but from the report in the Times, which the same Brentano characterized as of necessity botched. Naturally so, for in Hansard the vexatious sentence is missing. Eleanor Marx had no difficulty, in the same issue of Today, in dissolving all this argumentation into thin air. Either Mr. Taylor had read the controversy of 1872, in which case he was now making not only line insertions, but also line suppressions, or he had not read it and ought to remain silent. In either case, it was certain that he did not dare for a moment to maintain the accusation of his friend Brentano that Marx had made a lying addition. On the contrary, Marx, it now seems, had not lyingly added, but suppressed an important sentence. But the same sentence is quoted on page 5 of the inaugural address, a few lines before the alleged lying insertion. And as to the contrariety in Gladstone's speech, is it not Marx himself who refers in Capital, page 806, note 40, to the continual crying contradictions in Gladstone's budget speeches of 1863 and 1864. Only he does not venture, a la Sedley Taylor, to resolve them into complacent liberal sentiments. Eleanor Marx, in concluding her reply, sums up as follows. Marx has not suppressed anything worth quoting, neither has he lyingly added anything, but he has rescued from oblivion, a particular sentence of one of Mr. Gladstone's speeches, a sentence which had indubitably been pronounced, but which somehow or other had found its way out of Hansard. With that, Mr. Sedley Taylor, too, had enough. The result of this whole professional cobweb spun out over 2 decades. Back then, the drama had a much slower pace. Instead of a few-day YouTube cycle, you got a several decade cycle of counter polemics in newspapers. 2 decades and 2 great countries is that nobody has since dared to cast any other aspersion upon Marx's literary honesty. While Mr. Sedley Taylor, no doubt, will after this put as little confidence in the literary war bulletins of Herr Brentano as Herr Brentano will in the papal infallibility of Hansard. And then there's an extra footnote here. This was not, in fact, the end of this controversy. Brentano came back into the fray once again, which led Engels to publish a more comprehensive refutation of Brentano's charges, with all the documents concerned appended in pamphlet form, Brentano contra Marx, reprinted in the Marx Engels Works 22. So yeah, not the most important part for understanding capital itself, which we will dive into properly next Sunday. But yeah, you can see that many of the tendacious manners of trying to discredit Marx and Marxists were around as much as in his days as they are today, and similar sort of dishonest tactics are deployed. And yet, especially impressive for, I mean, a book like this, written in the 19th century, the scholarship behind it remains pretty much unquestioned. Obviously, plenty of people take issue with the various theoretical ideas, presuppositions, but no one can accuse Marx of having misquoted things, misrepresented arguments. He has, done a work which has stood the test of time and stands the test of time better than most, even contemporary academic publications. All right, so those are all of the prefaces, all of the Marx Engels prefaces. Now there is, what we will not be going through is, there is a long introduction by Ernest Mandel that is also part of this edition. But it's sort of an attempt to kind of summarize some of the ideas. It doesn't necessarily go through everything in depth. And for our purposes, going forward for the next streams, as we dive into the text proper, I think it's good to be wrestling with the text itself, and yeah, working to understand it and construct it. Now, as Marx has warned, the first chapters are the most difficult, so prepare for the next few Sundays to be some of the slower and more difficult walks through this text. And later chapters tend to be a bit more accessible, flow more like work of history, and are somewhat easier to understand and work through. But all of it is valuable and important, and sometimes hard things are worth going through. But this is where we will leave it for this Sunday. We've finished the prefaces, which is a start, and we will begin next Sunday on the actual text itself of Capital. So definitely be here next Sunday. And throughout the week, I will be doing my normal streams as well, which will be far less theoretical. But yeah, thanks to everyone who's dropped by to hang out, even for a bit. And we will we'll build up this tradition of Sunday socialist reading streams. So yeah, thanks everyone for stopping by, and I will see you of our streams going forward.